Okay, sir. So we are live now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to today's session of Voyages in the Past, Otit Prabaho. And our today's topic is Small Histories, Big Stories, Microhistory and its importance in historical practice. And our today's lecturer is Professor Sajal Nag. Professor Sajal Nag is a professor of modern and contemporary history at Assam Central University, Silchar, India. He was the first Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose Distinguished Chair Professor in Social Sciences, Presidency University, Kolkata. He has been Charles Wallace Fellow at the Center of South Asian Studies, University of Cambridge, 2008. He has been a Commonwealth Fellow to United Kingdom during 2004 and 5. He was a visiting fellow at Queen's University Belfast and Wolfson College, Cambridge. He was also awarded the Senior Fellowship at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi, during 2002. He was the member of the Government of India's NCERT Curriculum Revision Committee and in contemporary Indian politics. He is currently an executive member of Indian History Congress and joint secretary of the International South Asian Environmental Historians. He has been the Oxfam consultant for Northeast Indian Affairs and a part of its India Disaster Report and Violence Mitigation and Amelioration Project and contributor to its India Disaster Report. His publications include Root of Ethnic Conflict, Nationality Question in Northeast India, India and Northeast India, Mind, Politics and the process of integration, Bridging State and Nation, Politics and Peace in the Nagaland and Mizoram with Ria Machanda and Tapon Bose and many others. His edited volumes are Making of the Union, Merger and the Princely State, Exclude Areas with India, Forces of Nature, Essays in Environmental History of India, and many others. So we are very lucky to have him with us. And now that the platform is yours, it's over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sambit. Thank you, Anirban, for having me here, for inviting me over. And though the audience here, I believe, is a large, has a large coverage, my primary concern is my former students in residency, and because I have a lot of attachment to President and my former students there, that I have agreed to talk something which would be perhaps exciting for them, which would help them to formulate their research proposals in future. And of course, the other the August gathering that I have here for this lecture. Thanks to all of them for sparing your time to be here. Thank you so much. And what I propose to speak today, what I called small histories. From the title itself, you know that by small histories, I mean what is in today's parlance known as microhistory. Microhistories have been often ridiculed as small histories. But my emphasis is that this small history can actually tell us big stories which even universal histories and global histories often fail to do. And this is why my emphasis on what is known as small histories, and through examples of certain episodes of these so-called small histories, I'll try to reflect that these small history actually reflect the histories of bigger societies, bigger nations in a microcosm, and therefore in no way small histories or micro histories can be ignored. In fact, that should be the emphasis in today's historical practice. To do so, I'll start with the trajectory history, the history of historiography itself. As we all know that historiography or history writing originated in Greek, ancient Greek and Rome. And very, very interestingly, if you study the history of historiography, the way history was written in ancient world of the Greeks and the Romans, or even other areas of China, India, and Egypt, what is known as the Orient, where history writing had originated. Uh, this history writing had an origin in what is known as logography. Logography means history of a family, of an individual, where his genealogy is explored and written about and preserved, so that an individual has an identity, so that individual knows where he has come from, where he is migrated from, who are his forefathers. Uh, and this is a common practice in most ancient civilizations, either being it's Greek or Rome or even in India. In India, and especially among the Hindus, uh, there is a practice of chalk writing or horoscope writing, where you'll say that the genealogy is preserved. This is what is called logography, where uh, through an individual's identity and his genealogy is written about and preserved for posterity. This has been the origin of all history writing. Now, when I say genealogy of an individual, it shows how important micro history is, and micro history is the origin from where today's historiography, whether it is global history or universal history, that has come from. It has combined this logography is a compilation of oral tradition. It relates to the origin of town, people, places, and individuals. It combines geographical and cultural informations and may be seen as the earliest form of ethnography or anthropology. This has come in a new form today in today's world. Are the father of history, the Greek man called Herodotus, actually started writing history from this logographic practice. This logographic practice has been enhanced and developed to be what he called history. Uh, so logography or this micro historical practice cannot be ignored at all. In fact, if you read the history of Herodotus, whatever he has written, his collection called Histories, is nothing but a history of the Greco-Persian War. And in this Greco-Persian War, what Herodotus tried to do in his preface, he had said that the purpose of his writings, of his historiography, is nothing but preserving the achievements and the cultures of his community, of the Greeks, of the city state that he belonged to. Uh, and what he did is not really history, it is contemporary history. He wrote about present, he did not write about the past, because the concept of writing about the past, the methodology of writing of the past was not there. So he wrote about the past and had a profound understanding, profound philosophy of writing history, that this history is only for preserving the present for future generation. And this is such a profound philosophy. All history, though, I mean, in history, what do? We write about the past, but why do we write about the past? For our present, for our future. And this is what we do it today. And even when the first history was written by Herodotus in ancient Greece, he said that this is what his objective too. Uh, Now, what Herodotus wrote was microhistory. It's a small state, small state, a small war, a small place he wrote about. And what he wrote about, from what he's writing, though even if there are, as you know, there are many city states in Greece then, he wrote about only one of those city states. And despite being one of the, it reflected the history of the entire Oriental civilizations, or entire Occident. Uh, I want to mention here that while writing about the Greco-Persian wars, Herodotus had talked about the Orient, that is the Persian Empire, with whom his uh, city-state was at war. He wrote that this was a clash between two different cultures. One is the Asian culture, that is the Egyptian culture, and the other is the Greek culture. And he showed that there is cultural differences. He for the first time and discovered and told the rest of the world what are the differences. He said that he we thought that Greeks have the greatest civilization, but Egyptians has a civilization which predates the Greek civilizations, and therefore Greeks, Egyptians had a history of an older civilization than Greece himself. He talks that Greeks had a different customs. For example, the Egyptians did not eat wheat or barley. What he did, in fact, they needed dough with their feet. I mean, this is very strange. He said the Greeks have used wheat to prepare their food, their bread, with the hand, but the but the Egyptians needed their doves with their feet. And on the other hand, to make their houses and their sculptures, they needed their mud and dung with hands. Similarly, Egyptians lived with animals, unlike the Greeks, and they wrote from right to left, which is completely contrary to the Greeks who wrote from left to right. And he also observed that in Egypt, women attended markets and trade, while men had sit at home and at the looms. This is very strange. This is very interesting that what even before the Arabic and Persian languages had emerged, the Egyptians had already started writing. They were writing from right to left. Their women were attending markets with trade, while men were sitting and doing the domestic chores. They made their food with feet, while prepared with their sculptures and houses with hand. This is completely different than what the Greeks did. This is how he tried to bring about through despite the fact that he was writing microhistory, he was reflecting on two different cultures. What Herodotus thus wrote the microhistory of the Greek city-states, one of them, about the war between Greeks and the Persian, and following him, his his uh, mm, his disciple Thucydides did the same thing. He also wrote microhistory, and he though he felt that his history was not comparable to Herodotus, not romantic enough for people to read. He felt even then he was writing the history. He wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, and through this he was trying to keep or preserve the memories of his city states for future, for posterity. These are city these are microhistories. So what I'm trying to say, ancient Greek and Rome, when they started writing history, they actually wrote microhistory. They they did not even write the entire Greece or Rome. They wrote their small uh, states, small wars, small communities, and uh, small wars they fought, but they were not apologetic about it. They mentioned Then not only they are writing it for preserving the memories of these states for the future generation, but also through it they're propounding a very, very profound philosophy that history writing is necessary for identity, for future, for preserving the future for posterity. After Herodotus and Thucydides, the Greek history does not go much forward. In fact, there are few historians only, but they also upheld the history writing of Herodotus, and through they did not their writing did not even match Herodotus and Thucydides. What they wrote was annals and biographies, and these annals and biographies too were actually of micro nature. These are biographies of individuals, annals of small clans and small royal families. And this is how the trajectory history, the journey of history writing started with micro history. The trajectory takes a bend after the Greek historiography, when we enter the Christian era, where after the birth of Christ, where we find a new kind of historiography which doesn't really uphold microhistory. Here, history, what we call it historiographical terminologies as theocentric history, meaning then history becomes divided into two polars. One is history after the birth of Christ, and history before the birth of Christ, history of the Christians and history of the non-Christians. So non-Christians are described as pagans and barbarians, while Christian history was called the history of civilization and history of the civilized people. Saint Augustine and other wrote their history. This history, as you know, was dictated by the necessity of the church, and the priestly and the ecclesiastical personnel had been involved in writing of this history. In this theocentric history, all history started from the birth of Christ, and those who come under the purview of the Christian history are the history of a proper people. All history are called history of barbarians and pagans, and therefore dividing history into two parts: that history of the Christian world and the history of the non-Christian. So from micro history, the history of the world gets divided into two history. And then comes the the philosophy of positivism. From 16th century onwards starts the scientific revolution in Europe, the discovery of sciences, the sea voyages, discovery of new nations, scientific invention had started, and therefore world, because scientific laws are universal, they are not applicable to one particular community or one community. So scientific science and scientific laws has to be seen in the global perspective, in the universal perspective. All laws, scientific laws, are universal. Now, when encouraged by the scientific discoveries, when science made a leap, science emerged as a most important discipline of most important branch of human knowledge, which has applicability, which can be applied in people's life. Historians, philosophers, they wanted to write history, because history is one of the mother disciplines, is older than many other social sciences, that the philosophy of positivism should be applied in history. And what is this positivism? Means history should be written and studied in such a way that in history too we can discover laws, those laws which can explain events and happenings in human life. And not only that, because sciences are universal, these laws should be applicable in all societies, all nations, all countries. And therefore we prepare one global history, one global thing, which is seen from the positivism, where laws can be deciphered, Therefore, events and happenings not only can be explained, but can be predicted, like science. On the basis of scientific laws, you can predict what is going to happen. So historians, philosophers of positivism wanted that in history too, there should be laws of social development, which should be discovered and applied in such a way that all happenings, all events can be explained and even predicted. And therefore, from bipolar history of the theocentric age, suddenly with the coming of positivism, we find that history is again becoming global, which is known as positivist history or universal history, where the unit of historical study was the globe, not one small community or small nation or a small country or even not even a small continent. It is the entire globe. Then from positivism comes the period of enlightenment, reformation, and that period again, what emerges is known as, from the Renaissance and Reformation, what is called modernity, where science and scientific enquiries are the basis. No history, no philosophy, no religion would be accepted unless they are scientifically explainable. Rationalism became the basis of all human knowledge. Science and scientific basis should be the foundation of all knowledge. And therefore, modernity. While modernity emerged, history again took the predatory history took another different turn. What is this turn? This turn is history should be scientific. Meaning, how do you make history scientific? Not the way positivist thought, but the way is for a knowledge, for a discipline to be scientific, what is required? First, a proper definition of history. The definition discipline should be defined scientifically. Secondly, it should have a scope. Its scope should be delimited. And thirdly, it should have a methodology which should be scientific. And therefore, knowledge has to be empirical, because unless it is empirical, it cannot be proved. From Herodotus onwards, everybody wrote history, but nobody questioned them that whatever you are writing, whether it is provable, whether we can prove that whether it actually happened. But with the coming of modernity, when history was emerging as a new discipline, as a scientific discipline, it was the efforts were made that all historical knowledge or historical the events and happening that we describe as history should be provable. And for making it provable, what you need is evidence. And therefore, nobody can question the scientific basis of history. Nobody can question whether the validity of historical events. So we have Leopold von Ranke coming out with the concept of empirical sciences, that history should be empirical and history should be scientific. And therefore, for the first time, history began to be defined. Leopold von himself defined it. After that, a number of them have defined in various ways. Their scope was defined and its methodology was laid down so that history can be written according to proper methodology. So what I'm trying to say is that from the origin of history, where history was written in the micro, history was coming a long way. It was becoming bipolar, then it is becoming universal, and now it is becoming effort was being made to make it scientific. And to make it scientific, even Leopold von Ranke had propounded that history has to be universal history. All history, even if you write small history, it has to be fitted into the scheme of universal history. if you read the history of one particular area of the globe, you should be able to understand the other parts of the globe. Thus, history becomes scientific, and it becomes established as an academic discipline fit for studies in university, and therefore in the 19th century history makes its appearance in the universities as a subject of study. And then comes the great revolution known as the discovery of the new world. Small nations of Europe, people from those countries come out, who are known as merchant middle class, form their their business ventures, come out of their countries, go to the new countries of Latin America, Africa, Asia, Australia, Canada. All these countries discover new areas, and then what starts the what is known the period of imperialism and colonialism. Now, period of imperialism and colonialism was also the period of history writing. And in this period, what you write, what you see, history writing takes a different uh, trajectory. In its trajectory, it takes a different bend. In that, history of imperial ventures are written. How new countries are, new areas, new territories, new peoples are conquered. So, history of imperialism, or imperialistic history, it is called. And then, when that history ends, when there are nationalistic uh, emergence of nationalism in these colonized countries, you write history in the history of nationalism in these small states, and thus now it is the time for thematic history, imperialism. So imperialism, history of nationalism, history of regionalism. In these, again, history gets divided into different territories. Now, for European English imperialism, there is one history. There is German imperialism, there is another history. For German nationalism, one history. Italian nationalism, the colonial nationalism, there are another history. So history is again getting bifurcated into different themes, rather than people, rather than territories, rather than clans. And then comes two world wars, the First World War and Second World War. I'm talking all this in a very, very short way because I have to go to the main theme of microhistory, which I'm still, this is just the prelude. Now, in the First World War and Second World War had devastated the world. It devastated ideas, it devastated economies, it devastated polities, it devastated ideologies. Why? Because Europe, in its heyday in the 19th century, talked about glorious ideology, very liberty, equality, fraternity, all these humanism, philanthropism, all these great ideas were flourishing in Europe. But the Second World War showed that all these ideologies, all these ideas have no meaning, because in front of the greed of the people forget about liberty, equality, fraternity. If there was equality and fraternity, 6 million Jews would not have been killed, or devastation would not have taken place in the name of war. Actually, these wars were wars of greed, wars of hegemony, wars of supremacy. So when it comes to the question of power, supremacy, and hegemony, all these other highfalutin ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, and humanism, all these did not mean anything. And as a result, people started questioning the very, very foundation of what is called modernism. And that is why all disciplines, not just science, even in social sciences, philosophies, history, philosophy, sociology, which is taking birth now, all these disciplines are reorienting themselves. They are questioning the basic postulates of these disciplines, these ideas. And from there, what happens is what is known as the emergence of postmodernism. It is very interesting at this stage, postmodernism emerges simply. Postmodernism is not an ideology, it is only an approach. It questions all other existing ideology. It questions all other approaches, all other truths, as it were. What we accepted so far as truth have been questions. As far as history is concerned, they started asking questions like, whatever we read in history books, how do we know that this has actually happened? Obviously, the teachers will say, those who are writing, they will say there are evidence. We have provided evidence following Ranka. We are provided evidence that this has happened. There are proofs. Now, problem is there only one truth? This question comes because on the same event, if three persons are writing and three persons are using the same material, are we getting the same conclusion? So three different historians are coming out with three different conclusions, three different versions of the same event, which proves that there is not one single truth, there are multiple truths. And therefore, the second question is, you say there is evidence, it is scientific because evidence is provided. But is there only one kind of evidence? The kind of evidence one historian used, is it all? Are there not other evidences available? And then they find, no, there are. We have used only one kind of evidence, mostly written evidences. There are other evidences available which are non-written, which is oral, which is folk. And these evidences are not used, and if you use them, you get a different history. Therefore, truths are not one. The factity of facts are doubtful. Evidences are not one. There are difference of evidences, and therefore, what the postmodernists are saying, that you have to admit, therefore, unlike the modernist, that there are multiple truths, and therefore there are multiple histories. They've also come out with another fact, that which they borrowed from the structuralist, that the biographies and the annals are not correct history. They do not represent people's history, and they are histories of individuals and clans and countries, but they are not the history of the people. Structuralists used that there are broader overarching social and political movements or structure which actually determine what has happened. Individual actions are not independent of those structures or movement, and therefore individuals did not rise to power, or individuals did not cause wars or devastation on their own. There were social, political, even psychological imperatives that determined the course of history. And therefore, then the question is, what do the postmodernists suggest then? Because history cannot disappear just because you say there are multiple truths and there are evidences are multiple, and the conclusions are multiple. Therefore, what kind of history should be written? Postmodernists came out with this, that the only history that is acceptable history is microhistory. What is microhistory then? They are saying microhistory is the smallest, the historical method whose object is to write about the smallest unit of research, smallest groups, by studying whom you can isolate the ideas, beliefs, practices, and actions of a particular group or community which would otherwise remain unknown if you use the more conventional historical studies. If you use the modernist historical strategy or historical methodology, you cannot isolate the idea, belief, practice, and actions of small groups which determine historical courses. And therefore, microhistory is the only viable history. They gave the example. They said, when there is interaction between Europe and the New World, meaning when there were when the European powers went out of their nation in search of wealth to the non-European countries of America, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, and Africa, and they discovered a new world. To their surprise, Europeans are not much aware that that outside Europe there are civilizations. Outside Europe there are people, there are communities. There were civilizations who are white is not the only color. There are blacks, there are browns, there are yellow, and the European food is not the only food. European dresses is the only, or not the only. There are people out there living in those who have developed their own culture, own food, own dresses, own civilization, own polity, own economy. And surprisingly, those civilizations were richer than Europe. And this is what actually is what is called the clash of civilizations. Clash of civilization is not what Samuel Hamilton discovered in the 20th century between clash of civilization between Islam and the non-Islam world. Clash of civilization taken place in the 17th and 18th century when Europe clashed with these new territories, new people, and in while in this in this clash, in this encounter between two civilizations, Europe has devastated these civilizations. They have robbed the people, they have killed the people, they have committed genocide, and they have taken the wealth out of this country in such a large measure that Europe had become rich and impoverishing these small communities, small nations, and small countries which remain outside Europe for so long. And about these encounters, uh, there are encounters between the tribes of in this encounter Europe discovered two new things. One, first, what they call nations. Remember, we call ourselves nation now. Europe is a nation, England is a nation, France is a nation, Germany is a nation, India is a nation. But the first time the word nation was used by Europeans when they encountered these small tribes. This word nation means different people. It did not mean a political community of people. So they discover in this encounter, they discover two things. One is nation, whom later on nation was replaced by the word tribe. And interestingly, it is this encounter now is a fascinating area of research in America and Europe, where how these voyagers, people, Europeans, adventurers who went to these countries, either in Latin America and Africa, and how they meet one small people, their first encounter between two completely different cultures. In this encounter, how the white men reacted or acted, and the half Africans or the Latin American reacted. Uh, the Latin American or African or the were invariably defeated and crushed and sometimes completely exterminated. But in this encounter, the narration of this encounter is a major area of research in anthropology now. Microhistory can be as a result of this encounter, because microhistory has to take into account the culture of these small people. Because it's a small people, is easy to study. Small culture, their oral literature, oral culture, their oral uh, traditions, folk traditions, folk song, folk dance, everything. And this way, you have a new kind of archive the source on the basis you write history, and therefore microhistory is the true history, only viable, valid history according to the postmodernists. If I've been able to, I do not know whether I've been able to show that historiography started with microhistory, and it has the postmodernism after the devastation of the Second World War, when major ideologies and major philosophies of the world received a shock. People have gone back to, through postmodernist approach, gone back to writing microhistory, showing that microhistory is the most important viable history. And some of the historians in Europe and America are showing that. What I will do now is show, because I work on Northeast India, I work on the tribes of Northeast India, I'll try to show through some examples that how history, this micro history, can be the most viable history, because micro history is not necessarily micro. It doesn't really talk about one single people, one small community. You might be talking about a small community of 5,000 people, but the micro history of these 5,000 people is actually a reflection of the history in microscope of a larger nation, of a large community, of similar such communities. Uh, you know, now I'll come back to India and two micro histories. What one happened, one particular area historical event that I want to discuss is on the small state of Mizoram, a small community of 5 lakh people called the Mizo community. And if there is time, maybe I can talk about another community. But though I'm talking of a small community in a small corner of the globe, in a small corner of the, it doesn't necessarily mean that this community, this history is small, in the sense that a small company formed in England, far away in England, called East India Company, moves out of its shores to do business with the rest of the world, and comes to various part of the world, comes to India, does business, does trading, does commerce, and in the process develops a vast empire in South Asia. And though I'm talking of a small community of the Mizos living in the frontier of India, they are how they are affected by small development in far away in England. This is what I'm going to discuss. You know, the way in when we study imperialism and colonialism from economic perspective, we divide it into various phases. In the phases of merchant capitalism, phases of industrial capitalism, phases of finance capitalism, and then come to imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. This is how we understand various phases of imperialism, how imperialism from industrial revolution to the Second World War, the development, the trajectory of imperialism is studied by dividing into various phases. But there are another way of studying imperialism. It is by dividing the British colonialism in India into two, not just India, in wherever British colonialism was there, into two important phases, two important categories. One is called the Hanoverian period, and another is called the Victorian period. Now, in the Hanoverian period of British imperialism, what happened? The British had grabbed power in Asia, land in America, and slaves in Africa. Native people were taxed, robbed, were wiped out. Paradoxically, the culture of these people were tolerated in the Hanoverian period. In the Victorian period, however, things happen differently. Here, the Victorian were not happy only by defeating people, colonizing peoples, enslaving them, taking away, draining their wealth. They also had elevated aspirations. They dreamt of not just ruling the world, but quote unquote redeeming it, means liberating them. I'll tell you what liberation for them means. It was not enough for them to exploit other races, they wanted to improve on them. Native peoples themselves would cease to be exploited, but their their cultures, their superstitions, their beliefs were considered backward and heathen and pagan, and therefore those have to be changed or transformed. So Asia and Africa, all these were called dark continents, dark periods of history. And therefore, in these dark areas, it is the bounden duty of the British to bring light. Bring light. And this is how what this is the difference between the Hanoverian period and the Victorian period of British colonialism. So from the 19th century, suddenly we see the British. There are a number of British themselves who are criticizing British imperialism itself. There are a number of them who are talking that British imperialism should be utilitarian. There is an entire utilitarian philosophy emerging, that unless the British rule is beneficial or utilitarian to the British, it will not work. Therefore, the concept of white man's burden, the civilizational discourse starts, meaning that these civilizations, these people, the colonized people, are backward, they are dark, they are heathen, they are pagan, and therefore they have to be civilized. And it is the white man's burden, a very holy burden, that they have to be transformed, they have to be civilized. In, in a place, African coast called Sierra Leone, a man called Zachary Macaulay, who was the manager of one of the sugar plantations. Now we all know the atrocities of the that takes place in the sugar plantation, the slave trade over sugar planters, and how half of the African population were enslaved, taken to the American sugar plantations and enslaved there. Now this Macaulay suddenly found that the exploitation of the slaves and his Christian faith was not reconciling. It was irreconcilable. Thing. And therefore, what he found, he left the sugar plantation, left Sierra Leone, and went back to his place in England called Clapham. And he started criticizing the institution of slavery perpetuated by his own countrymen, the Britishers. In Clapham, he found another man whose name was William Wilberforce, who was thinking similarly, who was a British MP, he was also criticizing the practice of slavery by the Europeans, by the British especially, and the demanded an abolition to this inhuman practice. And together, William Wilberforce and Zachary Macaulay started a new political movement under the name called Clapham Sact, and there emerged a new kind of politics called politics of humanitarianism. In this politics, they began to demand that the exploitation of the slaves, and in fact the practice of slavery itself has to end. It is inhuman. It doesn't go with the high ideals of the British, high ideologies of the British, and therefore it has to be stopped. And it was stopped in 1843, and because of this movement. And then they found that it was not enough. The the faith, the culture that these colonized people have, that has to be upgraded. And how it has to be upgraded? They found the only way to redeem them, liberate them from their backwardness, from their paganism, is to bring them under the kingdom of God, kingdom of Christ. In other words, Christianity has to be given to these colonized people. And therefore, together with another person, means Charles Grant, they started demanding that all the colonies, especially India, should be now opened for propagating of Christianity. Remember, till this time, propagating the European East India English East India Company was abhorred to the idea of interfering in the religion of the Indians. They did not want that with the culture and religion of the Indians or of the people of colony should be interfered with, because they feared that this will lead to violence. Uh, but the movement that these three men started after the abolition of slavery, they formed a company called Society for the Promotion of Christian Gospel in 1698. Following which, in 1701, they formed another organization called Society for the Propagation of Christian Gospel. Together, they were asking that through these organizations, they will move to the colonies where they will propagate Christianity. 16 years later, man named William Carey, while preaching, announced that great things are happening, happening from God, and therefore, soon after that, they formed what is called the Baptist Society for Propagating Gospel among the Heathens. Followed by this was the formation of a very important society. These are all NGOs. I mean, these days we talk about voluntary organization and NGOs. These are the earliest NGOs in the world who practiced what is known as humanitarian politics. London Missionary Society, they were not only formed, they were recruiting people, inviting people to join this firm for missionary activities. In 1799, they formed another organization called Anglican Church Missionary Society. By that time, there are already 3 Scottish societies in Edinburgh, and some similar societies were being formed in the Wales of England, where they are demanding that these colonies should be open for Christian enterprise. Now, transforming the culture, transforming the belief, religion of the people was not an easy task. For that, missionary society needed people, young men, who were willing to take adventure into these colonies, which were considered very, very dangerous because the natives, as it were, because the people there were known to be very and violent and uh, they are reactive to any attempt to enter their society or interfere with their life, and therefore they needed a group of adventurous young men who are idealists, who are adventurous, and who are willing to go to any corner of the world to spread the good word of the God. It was a complete contrast between the motives of the missionaries and the previous generation of the empire builders. The colonies, remember, the empire builders also were young men, adventurers who went and fought the wars. The missionaries were to do same thing, but the impact of the missionaries were much more deeper than the others, because colonies disappeared, but the impact of the missionaries have not disappeared. Half the population in the colonies have remained Christians, and their cultures have been transformed. Now, by this time, what was happening? If you see India, why there was a number. No, it's not just that the East India Company was ruling part of India. Huge number of white men from England mainly and other part of Europe had come and settled in various parts of India, Banaras, Calcutta, and Delhi, and they were actually they are so fascinated by the Indian culture. They are actually adopting Indian cultures, living like Indians, marrying Indian women, and some of them had amassed so much wealth. They are emulating the life of Nawab, that they are calling themselves the white Nawabs. If you read the William Dalrymple's work on white Nawabs. It shows the entire 18th century where white men were living like Indians, Indian Nawabs, and adopting. Remember what I'm trying to say, that till this time Europeans were actually fascinated by the Indian culture and civilization. But this new sect, the Victorians, wanted this culture. They did not want this culture to remain. They wanted to be transformed and upgraded, which they felt can be done only through Christian faith, Christian religion. When the first missionary George Googly arrived in India, he found there was no sympathy, no incentive, or no encourage for missionary or from the East India Company. It was only after, during the tenure of the second bishop of Calcutta, Reginald Heber, in 1823, that some facilities were provided for the mission. Before that, according to the Charter of 1813, due to the pressure of the Clapham's Act, India was open to missionary enterprise, and missionaries had began to arrive in India to propagate Christianity. But the first few missionaries, when they came, they found neither the government was supportive nor there were incentives for them. But then things started to change. This background, in when missionaries started coming in 1833, Northeast India was not yet integrated with the other parts of British Empire in India. Most of Northeast India was not yet a part of British Empire. It is only after 1824 that Assam was annexed, and following which from 1823 to 1880s, the British could not conquer any of the tribes, though they were trying to enter the Nagas, the Mizos, and tribes of Arunachal Pradesh, but they are failing because of very, very strong retaliation and resistance from these tribes. Only by the 1880s, the British were able to enter this area and establish some kind of a rudimentary control of Mizoram. I'll talk of Mizoram now, in then known as Lushai Hills. And in 1880s, the British were able to enter a place called Aizawl, which is now the capital of Mizoram. But they are finding it very difficult to rule the Lushais or the Mizo tribes. It is this time that the Christian missionaries who had now traveled to some parts of Assam, the American Baptist missions had entered Assam. They have failed miserably in converting anybody. From there, they are trying to enter Nagaland and Manipur, where they are trying to convert people, where again they are failing miserably. They had entered Barak Valley, that is Silchar. They have entered there. They have failed miserably to convert anybody. Few Bengalis were converted, but even few tea garden levels were converted. But this was quite a miserable failure. Therefore, they wanted to enter Lushai Hills, because Lushai Hills by then has been known as a place of headhunters, head of slave drivers, and a very, very violent primitive tribe. So the first mission that entered, Christian mission, what is known as Earthington Mission. Earthington, as you perhaps know, is a very, very powerful rich man who was sponsoring missionaries to go into different parts of Asia and Africa and convert people. So two missionaries came to Lushai Hill, started working, but again failed miserably. They hardly could convert anybody, and they had to leave Lushai Hill soon because of the conflict with the headquarters. And then on their entry, the same missionaries came back again, and another mission house known the Wales Presbyterian Mission entered Lushai Hills. Now, Wales, as you know, it is from Wales. It's a Presbyterian mission, but Wales missionaries are little different. The way, see, in England there are three groups: the English, the Wales, and the Scots, and the Irish. Now, Irish is one of the earliest colonized people in the world. Similarly, Scots were colonized and the Welsh were colonized. Now, therefore, though they were part of England, they are part of English imperialism. There was concealed, hidden conflict between the English missionaries and the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish. Now, these Welsh missionaries, when they came, their hostility towards the English people was reflected in their missionary work in Lushai Hills also. Now, Lushai Hills then was one of the most backward areas. British rule was not able to take control of the situation. There was missionaries were not successful in getting any convert. Now, when the mission was failing in its work to convert people, one missionary arrived in Lushai Hills from Wales. His name was Peter Fraser. Peter Fraser was quite a radical young man. He was a doctor. He was one of the earliest MBBS doctor, Wales doctor. He was a doctor with the British government in England. But he was despite though he was radical, he was also very religious bent of mind. Had a belief that through religion, through he can he can be of service to the people who are downtrodden, who are suppressed. So before coming here, he had worked with the industrial workers in the slums of England, in the Wales, and he had earned quite a name as a radical doctor with radical ideas. This man suddenly offered himself to the Welsh Presbyterian Mission to go to Lushai Hills and work among the tribals there. Now, since he's a doctor, and the mission needed doctors very badly, because they immediately sent him to Lushai Hills. So Peter Fraser came to Lushai Hills with his wife Mary Fraser to live among the Lushais in 1908 and work for propagating the Christian faith among the Lushais. Peter Fraser, because he was a doctor and he could treat people very, very quickly, immediately he became very, very popular. Very popular that so it so happened he was considered to be a miracle man because he could cure people immediately. You know that by then the Lushais were dependent on their village priest and the sorcerers for the curing of their diseases. Even for a small disease of dysentery, the priest has to ask for huge ritual, which was very, very expensive, and the common users could not afford it. And in this place, Peter Fraser could cure by a simple tablet. So he was seen as a miracle man, and he became immediately popular. He was moving from one village to another. He was so popular that every village was inviting him and calling him to go to their village and treat their people. And while treating, whatever he was offering, people are willing to accept it. Like after treating them, if he asked them to ask people to convert, they would convert. And therefore, after the arrival of Peter Fraser, the rate of conversion among the Lushai Hills increased tremendously. Not only that, the common Lushais became very, very popular, became fan of Peter Fraser because Peter Fraser had taken with him as a musical instrument. He and his wife were good singers. He would collected the band of young men, sing with them, and teach them church song, mass prayers, and through which were popular among the musicians. In fact, music was changing from the traditional moorings, traditional character. It has become Welsh music. Also, Peter Fraser had taken with him as a small portable printer with which he was printing newspapers. journals, and through which he was spreading education also. So as Peter Fraser was doing real miracles in terms of conversion, in terms of winning people into his fold, into the into the fold of church. The government was little wary of this person. The same British government who was ruling in Lushai Hills, they say this missionary. Remember, those days missionaries had to take a permission to go to Lushai Hill. It was not, they had to take, like today, if you go to Mizoram, you have to take inner line permit. They had to take inner line permit and a special permission to propagate their faith there. So they had taken a permission, but the British government there in Lushai Hills were wary that this man is a radical man and he is becoming more popular than the government, which the government did not like. And the source of conflict was already there, and then suddenly it escalated. What happened was that in what happened was while converting people, suddenly Peter Fraser noticed there are a group of people who are refusing to convert, who are saying that we cannot convert ourselves because we don't have our right to be converted because we are slaves. We are slaves to certain chiefs, and therefore for us to be converted, we have to first take the permission of the chiefs. Peter Fraser did not understand the institution, but then he realized a certain institution was there which is very similar to slavery in Mizoram. And this he initially he bought the freedom of certain slaves by paying a certain sum and converted them. But then he realized that there is a huge population of slaves which he doesn't have the money to procure to secure their liberation by paying the amount, and therefore he adopted another approach. He asked the British government in Lushai Hills that the slavery has been abolished in British India in 1843. How is it that slavery is being allowed in Lushai Hills to continue even now? And therefore slavery should be immediately abolished. British government found this is a tricky situation because they thought that whenever you interfere with the culture of the social and cultural practices of the native people, they break out in rebellion and there is violence. So therefore they wanted to avoid it. They first told Peter Fraser, they don't interfere with their life. Whatever is there, you preach your religion, but don't interfere with their institutions, social institutions and cultural practices. But Peter Fraser did not listen to them. He said, I will write to the British government in England, in London, that such a practice, despite being abolished, it is continuing. So the British government in Lushai Hills immediately said that what you say is slavery is not a slavery. It is some people who are poor and deprived. They on their own volition voluntarily go and surrender to the chiefs, and in return of their permanent bondage to the chiefs, the chiefs provide them food, shelter, and life by generation. It is similar to slavery, but it is not slavery. It is a benign form of slavery. Peter Fraser did not agree with it. He continued to pressurize the local government that it must be abolished, otherwise I'm going to write to through newspaper and send the message to the British, and therefore they will take the initiative to abolish it. The Lushai government the British government in Lushai Hills took the drastic step. They expelled this missionary Peter Fraser from Lushai Hills. They asked him to leave, and he was forced to leave Lushai Hills. Now, Peter Fraser was undeterred. Though he was forced to leave Lushai Hills, he went back to England, and there he started fighting against the practice of slavery in Lushai Hills. And he started writing in London newspaper. He took the matter to a society called Aborigine and Anti-Slavery Societies London, which was very, very active then. And through this society, which was acting against all form of slavery in British form, he took the matter to the British Parliament. Now, the British Parliament immediately inquired into the matter and decided with the local government in Lushai Hills, British government in Lushai Hills, said and came out with the argument that what you say is what you say see as slavery is not a slavery. It is a benign form of bonded labor and which is beneficial for the people there, and therefore it cannot be abolished. There is no question of abolishing it. Peter Fraser did not stop his fight, even though his fight was rejected by the British Parliament and the British government in London. Through Anti-Slavery Society, he sent the matter to the League of Nations. In 1923, the League of Nations organized a convention against slavery at a global level. Convention against slavery, and in that slavery, through Anti-Slavery Society, Peter Fraser raised the issue of slavery in Lushai Hills in the League of Nations. League of Nations in this convention decided and resolved that slavery in all forms should be abolished throughout the world. And this mandate of the League of Nations was accepted, and here too, as a result, slavery in Lushai Hills was to be abolished too. But here, British government again played a role. They wrote a letter. They represented their case in the League of Nations, saying that in some part of India, like Lushai Hills, part of Burma, part of present Arunachal Pradesh, which are in the frontier between India and Burma, which are called unadministered area, where British has no control. British government has no control, British administration has no control. In these areas of Naga Hills, Arunachal Hills, Mizo Hills, people are very, very primitive, people are very, very uh, tribal and whom they call barbaric and tribal, and therefore they have certain practices which are similar to slavery, but since they have no control, these are unadministered area, these practices of these people cannot be stopped or altered by government interference because these are unadministered area, and therefore they have requested the League of Nations that these areas should be exempted from the resolution of the League of Nations against slavery. And therefore, in those outlying areas, slavery was allowed to continue because it was traditional practice of the people. But in Lushai Hills, what I was saying, the word for slavery, which is called boy, that through a declaration, the word was uh, abolished. The word was not allowed to be used anymore. So though the institution of boy was abolished, and the term boy was not allowed to be used anymore, it was in that sense, in the sense that through the initiative of Peter Fraser, the Welsh Presbyterian missionary, the very, very old ancient practice of boy was abolished in Lushai Hills. So in this episode, this is a micro history of a small piece, small community in small corner of the world. I am trying to show that there was interaction between a colonial government in India, a British power in England, a small British administration in Lushai Hills, a missionary individual and a missionary organization, and the Lushais themselves. In this interaction of so many forces, how the Lushai should live was decided by the British and by the English missionaries, all in Europe. As I said, in the Victorian phase, in contrast to the Hanoverian, the decision about the colonized people, how their life should be, were decided by the Victorians through their ideology and through their belief in England. And this was being implemented in far away frontier country of Lushai Hills by the Britishers, British administration, and the white missionaries. No, never the Lushais were taken into account. Lushais were asked what do they want. Without their asking, without their voices, without taking them into consideration, their life was transformed. Their culture was interfered with, their institutions were altered. And this is the power of colonialism. This is the power of colonial state. This is a result of the translation of the civilizational discourse that originated far away in Europe, and far away philosophers have conceptualized it, and it was being implemented in far away Lushai Hills, who were in 1947 only about 50,000 people. So in 1910, they might have been about 30,000 people. Now, this is microhistory, history of a small community. But the importance of this is what was happening in Lushai Hills had global implications. Global implications because the whole what was happening in Lushai Hills was not happening in only Lushai Hills. It was happening in Naga Hills. It was happening in Arunachal Pradesh. It was happening in Chota Nagpur. It was happening in Purulia. It was happening among the all the tribes of India, in Central India, in South India, in Eastern India. Similarly, this was interaction between the British rulers, British administrators, white missionaries. They are trying to interfere with the tribal's life, and they are transforming their lives. But it is not just India. The missionaries and the white rulers were doing the same thing in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, in Africa. Wherever there were native population, they have done the same thing. So through one, if you read the novel by Nobel laureate Chinua Achebe, who talks about how the novel is called Things Fall Apart. If you read the novel, shows how the tribal world was changing through missionary activities, through colonial administration, colonial rulers. And interestingly and amazingly, this is not happening in one place. The entire British Empire was one globe. And in this globe, Luhai Hills just one part. In other parts also, similar things was happening. Not only that, the if you take another, it's for example German imperialism or French imperialism, they are also a French world and a German. They are also it was similar things are happening, and therefore from this is why microhistory is so important. These intricacies, the intense study of a small community is all possible only by this micro study. But these micro studies produce profound philosophies, profound reflections. They are representation of the rest of the globe. They are history of a small place, history in a microcosm. It represents the history of the rest of the world. In this sense, this microhistory has global implications, and therefore unless we do microhistory, unless we take into account the oral and folk tradition of the people, unless we do intense studies, the intimate study, unless we, it is only through microhistory we can bring forward the voices of the people. Here, for example, Lushais, their voice can be brought only if we study through microstudy, because through microstudy we can do intense study, intimate study. And if we have intimate study, we can bring forth their voices in this history. Otherwise, the history of India would be history without Indians. History of Lushais will be history of without the Lushais. It will be partial history. It will be one-sided history. And therefore, this is why I want to history. This small history, therefore, has to big stories to tell. Small history is not small history. They represent the globe. I think I'll stop here. I've taken more than the time given. Thank you so much. Uh, I'll be happy to answer one or two questions or comments that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's really a great and very informative lecture. So, sir, now we're moving to the Q&A session. Our
Okay.
first question is,
Yeah.
Shotendra Mohan Jha is asking, sir,
Yeah.
please tell us microhistory of Mizoram community in details.
See, microhistory of the Mizos is not possible to say, the entire community is not possible here. Whatever I said, this is the microhistory of the Mizos. What I'm saying, I have taken one episode of the history of the Mizos, and that how that reflects the history of the entire tribal community under colonial domination. This is what I am trying to say. So uh, you say the micro, this is the macro history. Whatever I've said is the macro history of the Mizos, of the Lushais. And as you say, if it is, even though it is the micro history Mizos, it reflects the entire globe. Entire, it is the story of the entire, it reflects on the trajectory of historiography that I talked about, right from ancient Greece to the present. Right?
Okay, sir.
Mm.
There's no other question is in the chats. So, sir, can I
Okay.
ask you a question? It's my
Please. Yeah, yeah, sure. Mm.
sir. Sir, how this microhistory is differed from subaltern studies or subaltern history?
No, they don't differ. They complement. They complement. If you see subaltern history, they are a collection of micro histories.
Okay.
So they complement each other actually.
Okay, sir. There's another question.
Yeah.
Nidhi Pati is asking, sir, which
Mm.
part should young regional historian should follow the path for the local and the microhistory? Can you see the question in the screen?
Yes, yes, I've seen it. I've seen it. Yes. This is what I'm trying to say. Micro history means you pick up a small unit of history, pick as a small village or a small clan or a small district or a small village, study them intimately. You know, if you see what Herodotus had done, he's talked about a small community, small state. Greek city states are very, very small areas, small people. But small, because it is small, it allows you to have an intense study of the area. It allows you to have an intimate study of the area. And this is what you should do. But what you have to be careful is that your study, because it is micro study, it should not be unrelated to the global and national developments. It should be linked with the rest of the world. It should be linked with the existing discourses. It should be linked with the bigger stories, because then only it will be representative. Then only it will become a proper history, because history has to, whatever history, even it is micro history or macro history, it has to give you a profound philosophy. It will give that philosophy only. Micro history is linked with the development in the rest of the world.
Okay, sir. There's the last question for today.
Yeah. Mm.
Bitosri Singh is asking, what's your
Mm.
view about calling tribe as barbaric by the British government?
Uh, as I said, that barbaric and tribe, these are later developments. As I said, the earliest, when the European powers interacted in Latin America or Africa, they call them nations. But later on, the British started calling themselves nation. And then it became, if they call themselves nation, what would you call these people? From from this time, they started isolating certain ideas saying these are actually tribes. Now, what are these tribes? Means basically it is othering. They are trying to say these people are not equal to us, are equal to the white people. So othering means finding out differences. So what are the features of these tribalism? These tribes are basically itinerant people. They move from place to place. They don't settle in one place. Their nakedness, they have long hair. They, their religion is amorphous. They don't have institutionalized religion. They have practices like headhunting and slavery. Their agriculture is very primitive. They don't have settled agriculture. Their food is primitive. They don't have medicine. They have herbal medicine. They don't have Western medicine. They don't have state. They don't have political structure. They don't have literature. They are pre-literary society. So these are the features they isolated, and those who fitted them, they are described as tribes, basically meaning tribes are primitive and the white men are the most civilized. So to bring out that big difference between the two, these people are called tribes. Actually, there is nothing called tribes. I mean, tribes are as civilized or as advanced as anybody else.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you again for this very informative session. We are
Thank you.
very
Thank
glad
you so
to
much.
have you. Thank you for giving your precious time. Take
Thank you
care.
for having me over. Okay.
Take care.
Okay.
Stay safe.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
And Diwali is in 1 week, so please stay
Thank you.
safe and wish
Yes.
you all happy Diwali in advance. And
Same to
please
you.
follow please follow Otit Probaho or the Voyages in the Past for more
I will.
lectures and
I
related
will.
content.
I will.
Sir.
Thank you.